All right, ladies and gentlemen, can I have your attention, please? We are ready now to start the second panel of the EU Energy Day at the Hannover Messe. My name is Evelina Hartstein, and I am working at the European Commission in the Communication and Outreach Unit of Directorate General for Energy. We will be discussing today a very interesting and very important topic towards a European competitive wind sector powered by grids. The topic gives us a perspective that we are already on the way to achieving it, but the sector is already evolved and there is a lot of positive stories to be told. So joining me here on stage today is a nice list of panelists, high-level speakers. Let me present them to you very briefly, starting with Mechthild Wörsdorfer, Deputy Director General for Energy at the European Commission. We have Vera Brenze, Director of Public Affairs and Communications at the TenneT Holding. Mr. Martin Knops, Chief Technology Officer at the CF Wind Power Antwerpen NV. Matthias Föhr, Vice President of Lead Engineering in Grid Solutions at Siemens Energy. And Ulrich Stridbeck, Head of Regulatory and Public Affairs at Ørsted. Without further ado, I would like to first invite Mechthild Wörsdorfer to give us a couple of words of introduction.
Thank you, Evelina, and good morning for the second session where we speak mainly about wind power and grids. And I will give a few introductory words on where we are with the European wind industry and what are the key topics we think, and then we will go deeper in the panel discussion. So we saw 2023, when we speak about offshore wind, really a record year in offshore wind investments, and then after a low year in 2022. So we have to see where we go in the next couple of years and how we can help also the wind industry. There's another debate on the solar industry right now, but this panel will focus mainly on the wind industry. And in that sense, last October, we worked together with our member states, with the key stakeholders from industry, what we call a wind power action plan, because we felt that we need to do more. We have the renewables target of 42.5% of renewables by 2030 in Europe, and as we know, wind, solar are one of the key drivers in Europe to make that happen. So we have identified 15 actions, and I will only highlight 2 because then we can discuss a little bit more. So some of them which we have implemented is the European Wind Charter, which was signed in December by 21 member states, where we have concrete pledges, like in the COP world, we speak about pledges. So we asked member states to come out with their wind pledges, what they would like to invest by 2030. And we got it from 23 member states at a voluntary basis in order to ramp up the deployment of wind. And 2 particular actions we are focusing on. First one, I mentioned that this morning already, which we see as a key obstacles also for wind deployment, which is the long permitting time in all our member states to make the wind projects and also the related grids happening. So we have done a lot on how to make permitting faster with one-stop shops, with tacit agreement, with how best practice work in some of our member states, and we will come out by the end of this month or May with what we call a guidance where we are focusing on permitting in renewable acceleration areas. Acceleration areas are areas where we think the potential of wind is particularly high and where we can work together. A second element is that we are working on auction design. We have seen both for solar and for wind that we have to have an auction design where we can help EU manufacturing industry by also introducing non-price criteria like resilience, quality, cyber security, and that we are working on both on permitting and on also auction design. So these are 2 concrete actions which we are following it up in the wind power package. Related to that, and that I wanted to highlight, and we will come back, are the grids. We know we have more and more renewables projects, wind projects, but some of them are curtailed, they don't happen because we are lacking the related grids. And in order to make also the grids happening in Europe, either within EU member state or between EU member states. We came up with a grids action plan, which was discussed at ministerial level a week ago. And inside that, we have for the cross-border, for the European grids, from one member state to another, we have a lot of projects of common interest, which we are identifying both for electricity and hydrogen. And there, I think we need to accelerate as well to make that happen. So there are the transmission grids, the big one, the cross-border, the top one, but there is a lot of need also when we go down at the local level and at the distribution level. So both these actions are covered in our grids action plan. So from our side, EU side, together with the member states, with the industry, and we will hear more, what we need is really to work hand in hand, wind projects and grids, what we call anticipatory investments, so that we don't plan one at a time and then think about the other. We need to integrate that and anticipate already when we have a project offshore, onshore, that we already think from the start that we also need to invest in related grids. And that's a bit the topic of that panel today, and I'm very much looking forward to the other panelists to make their points.
Thank you very much, Mechthild. My first question will go to Ulrich. We've heard already that the Wind Power Action Plan, we have a lot of positive developments. We have very ambitious targets. The North Seas Energy Cooperation has very ambitious perspectives. We know that there's a progress in permitting and accelerated areas are being deployed across the EU. But from your perspective, from Ørsted perspective, what else is needed to make sure that we promote and push further wind development to meet our 2030 objectives?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting, and my first time at the Hannover Messe and visiting the European Commission here. I suppose that someone like me, I am employed by my company to complain about things and tell you what you should do better and more of. To be honest, I think just what Mechthild just outlined of actions that have been taken in the European Commission, among member states, but also nationally over the last 2 or 3 years is a very, very impressive list of actions that has really mattered. And we must understand, especially when dealing with offshore wind and grids, offshore grids particularly, that it is we're talking 5-10 year timelines. So these things also have to be allowed to do it's simply too soon to assess whether enough has been done. So let me start by that. However, we will look forward to now over just this year and the next massive offshore wind tenders that will come out. We will see where offshore wind developers will be in that, where the supply chain will be in that. I do frankly think there is one missing question that we have not quite taken by the horn yet. And that is that we are now in Europe, of course, still focusing on getting rid of fossil fuels from our electricity supply. We are solving that because wind is good, solar is good, and it's cheap. So we're doing that. The big investment that we are now embarking in is to feed new electricity demand. And new electricity demand is something that we talk of, but it's not there yet. That's the whole point. We want to build so that we are ready when it comes. And the amount of risk that we have to take making investments for electricity demand that is not there yet, it may end up requiring that we have contracts with society that helps us share those risks. So that is why I think that let's see, renewable energy is cost competitive. We do it merchantly now, increasingly. There may be a need for also using CFD contracts for different contracts to share the risks of investing in new electricity demand.
Thank you very much. Then moving on to Martin, we would like to hear your perspective. Do you think that the signals that you're getting through policymaking, the legislative framework, and what happens on the financing side are clear enough to ramp up manufacturing from your perspective?
Yeah, now we have a bit of noise. So I also want to start by appreciating what has happened on European level and also on some national levels like in Germany over the last year. I think the EU has really taken the step from ambitious targets to concrete measures to implement those targets. And that's a very decisive step because that was missing also before. However, this is still in the process when we look for the auction criteria, for instance, which are not defined yet, and it will also still take some time to define them. And that's in the end the decisive element, at least for the investments. And another word perhaps on the market development, we also need to understand that it all takes time. And that's also an issue because the ambitions have been very high, and also in the supply chain, the expectations have been very high. And 2 years back, we would have, I think, all believed that in 2024, the European market for wind turbines would have already been much higher than it is today. And that is, of course, also an issue in companies that in the end, from year to year, these plans are being pushed out on the timeline. And then it's also a bit a trust question. So that's at least what I see in my company and I think also left and right. Still, we believe it will come. So latest, we would say now in 26, 27, the European market will kick off, but only then, right? And when I speak now as a tier 1 supplier, so we do gearboxes for wind turbines. That's roughly 10% of the value of a wind turbine, so it's significant, but it's just that. Our customers, well, it's a very cost competitive market as well, and it continues to be. And European production is more expensive than non-European production. And I don't even talk about the Chinese competition, which we will talk about later, I think. But I also talk about where do we produce our gearboxes, because we have luckily also a global footprint. We also produce in India and yes, in China. And that has also been very important to survive. So basically the players which are still there have this global footprint. That's absolutely needed. And our customers today are not willing to spend more for European gearbox. Yeah. So that sounds very negative. Effectively, what we are doing is that we transform our European production plants more to offshore supply, because that's where it overall still makes sense, also cost-wise, to produce out of Europe for Europe. But the question whether we take additional investments to again build more onshore gearboxes as well in Europe, I would say that indeed depends then on the non-price criteria for the auctions and whether that is valued in the end or not.
Thank you very much. Allow me to ask a follow-up question to Ulrich, a bit along the same lines. How do you see the wind supply chain, its development, and what from your perspective are the main bottlenecks in this development?
Absolutely, as a consequence of ramping up, as we talked about before, as Martin also talked about, these are very, very big investment items with very, very big pieces of equipment. So it does take time, and ramping up will lead to bottlenecks, and we are seeing that, and I'm sure we will hear more about that also. I do think that this a bit of a perfect storm that we have seen, where there has been both bottlenecks and cost increases from materials and energy, has also led to increasing total costs for wind, at least for the grids. And in any case, I do think that our challenge, and for you in the European Commission and your discussions with member states, have to be is that at the end of the day, the amount of money that the users of the energy, industrial, German, European industry have to pay at the end of the day, that has to be affordable. That has to be containing our competitiveness. So having that in the back of the mind, when I buy my things from you, we got to get it cheaper again. And that I think that has to be the focus. Specific bottleneck items, indeed, it's the ships, it's the grids, but that can be solved. I'm convinced. The cost issue is probably more important.
Thank you very much. You've mentioned grids, so I suggest that we move to this part of the conversation now. And the first question goes to Mechthild, if you allow me. You've mentioned the grids action plan that was adopted at EU level, but how can we ensure that actually grids development follows the renewables deployment also in the perspective of 2030 and perhaps beyond? What is the EU doing?
So on that question on grids development, we had a very interesting debate a week ago in Brussels with the informal energy ministers, 1.5 day organized by the Belgian EU presidency, where we discussed only grids. So it was about how to scale up, how to finance, on what are the standards we need. And it was a very, very interesting debate. And from a member state's perspective, what I would see, which came up quite strongly, is a mixture of a top-down EU mapping, EU planning, looking at what is needed, combined with a bottom-up, what is needed at local or regional or national level, and how to bridge that top-down and bottom-up approach to make it happen was one of the main discussion points. Another one, I already mentioned it, is that there is a mixture of what we need on transmission grids, so the high voltage line from member states to other member states, and we work a lot, and there is a EU organization, ENTSO-E, where all the TSOs are member of. But then we also need the distribution system operators, the distribution grids, where there are nearly 2,000 in the EU, more than 900 in Germany alone, and then in many other member states. So how to make sure that they also are going hand in hand and that we listen to everyone. And then what is needed is investments. I mean, that is something, how to trigger demand, how to trigger investments. So one thing is obviously the regulatory framework to see that there's a predictability and some more certainty where to go. There's a need of money. And from the EU side, obviously, like all public money, it's rather scarce, and it's more the private money we need to trigger. So on the public money side, we have the Connecting Europe facility, which is really the top of the iceberg. It's the connecting member states, big projects, island France, the synchronization between the Baltic states, or an LNG terminal in Crete in Croatia, where you can go. And in the future, it's not only about electricity grids, but also hydrogen, where we look at. But the need for this huge amount of investments, I think how to trigger that was one of the main topics we discussed.
Thank you very much. Now turning again to Martin, your company produces gearboxes and they are an important component of wind turbines. You are of course the global leader, but faced with strong international competition, as we mentioned. So what in your perspective could be helpful to develop further and maintain this leading role in the market? Are the non-price criteria for auctions, for instance, a factor that you consider is going to be important? What else would be needed?
Yeah, I referred already to the non-price criteria when I answered the previous question, and indeed, especially for our production in Europe, that is a decisive one, right? When we look to the international competition, so basically we have two Western players left, we are one of them, and then we have Chinese competition, right? And I mean, we all know how strong China is. Perhaps still it is remarkable to see when we look at 23, for instance, world market for wind is or was 117 gigawatt, and 2/3 of that are in China. Yeah, I mean, I think that's very impressive, and it of course shows how big this home market in China is. It's on the one hand more or less not accessible anymore for Western players effectively. And on the other hand, it also gives, of course, the Chinese players who are active in this market quite some playing field and quite some economics of scale. I mean, if you serve a 70 gigawatt market, and that what we see through the complete supply chain, we also see it in other industries, that huge investments have been taken in China, and basically in the end also over investments. So they can not only serve this home market, they can serve more than the world market with the production capacities which they have installed. And that is of course a threat. Within China there's also heavy competition on prices, so basically not many companies make money there, but still they get through. And we have, for our Western markets, for our Western customers, still some competitive advantages, which of course we need to preserve. So it starts with quality and in the end robustness of our products. But that's not the only thing. For instance, in China, nobody cares about the noise of a turbine. Also not about grid compliance in the way as we know it here from your European markets. So gearboxes have little to do with grid compliance, but that's another competitive advantage still. And when it comes to the noise, gearboxes are typically source of so-called tonalities. So it's single frequencies which you hear and which can be quite nasty. And to avoid those, not in a try and error approach, but by in the design phase already, you need to have quite some deep understanding of the overall turbine behavior, including the gearbox with all frequencies, etc. That's unknown terrain for our Chinese competitors. And I think that is one big example for us, or as an entrance barrier still to the European market for these competitors. But in the end, within a couple of years, this can of course also be overcome. So that gives a bit of background. So we need to preserve our technology leadership with these aspects. And on the other hand, yes, I think we need to take on political level action if we want to avoid that Chinese takeover indeed. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now turning to Matthias for the Siemens Energy perspective on this interplay between harmonization of standards and innovation. How can we balance these two to preserve EU leadership?
Well, I think a very good question to somebody being responsible for innovation in the grid. I think what we have to understand is, if we look at the Grid Action Plan, Action 13, it's asking for common requirements, basically, technology requirements. It's not about the standard. If we want to develop the standard, we take another 5 to 10 years to align all TSOs in Europe, all OEMs, the whole supply chain. And then we have a standard, and we are technology-wise 10 years further, so the standard is old. What we are vouching for is functional specifications. And these would allow to not only go for the one standard, but to really say what is important for the grid, what's important to operate, to build the grid. And this is what we can see in the contracts there. It's obviously reliability, availability, losses, topics like those, which are also the major points where we sign contracts on when building infrastructure. And if we focus on these functional tenders, I think we can become also much faster. If we look at what we do when we build a grid, a project, even a product, we typically look for the golden triangle, quality, time, cost. So let's assume we don't want to compromise on quality because we don't want to get the lights go black. Then it's about cost and time where we can optimize. And functional tenders, from our perspective, would bring us into a situation where we are not that prescribed on which supplier to use, etc., but give more freedom, hence also more reliability in project execution at the end. Because what comes next? Yeah, we've been in these projects when Corona happened, we've been there when the Ukraine war started. It all heavily disrupted the whole supply chains. And as long as we have customers or agencies prescribing the solution, we always end up in a dead end, because you don't get steel from the Ukraine anymore, you don't get, cables from there anymore or whatsoever. With a functional approach, you can overcome this. Yeah, it's much easier to ask for different perspectives, and it's also possible to introduce innovations in this. Yeah? If we look for what is necessary, we are working on initiatives like Interopera, like Innovation Partnership for Grids, to bring DC actually to a grid level and not only to a line point-to-point connection. And these things can be incorporated, and I think we are on a very good way there. Now, what we have seen also is that TenneT, for example, where we talked about this, has introduced the 2 gigawatt standard. And yes, it's the standard, and there are some problems with that, which we see from an OEM perspective. But there's also very good things. Yeah? TenneT has changed towards a requirement management process in their whole tender process, which actually brings us to a very good starting point when defining functional specifications for these sort of grid projects for the future, and which is actually what we are currently discussing already within T&D Europe, with the TSOs, etc. So I don't think there's a contradiction in itself. We have to understand that if we write spec, we don't meet standard, yeah? And that, yes, standards at some parts are important and necessary. For example, if we go for DC grids, yeah, we need something like a grid code, which is nothing else than a standard. But if we are asking for functionality, it's enough to write down the requirements and not to specify the one and only solution which can be brought on the market.
Thank you very much. And since you have already pointed to Vera and the TenneT project, I would like to, if you can hear me okay, perhaps I could now offer the opportunity to Vera to present us the 2 gigawatt project and how it contributes to the offshore landscape in the EU.
Yeah, I think we don't have the most proficient community here only to talk about 2 gigawatt. I would first like to echo a little bit what my predecessors have said, or my previous speakers. I do think that we are in a decade now, or the last commission that is ending now has done an unparalleled job to expedite and also to ramp up and really leapfrog into a new level of green transformation. And if we want a green transformation for our entire economy, we have to start with the electricity grid, because electrification is the rational energy, and no electricity grid, no transmission. So no transmission without no transition without transmission. So what has that? In 2020, 2021, we started, in internal strategy talks, say like, well, how can we expedite our own activities? So we lose a lot of time if we go for auctioning. Because then usually you have 3 or 4 proposals, and out of those, 75% land in the bin, because you only choose for a fourth or a third of one of the 3 or 4 tenders. The second element was that we had an interoperability issue. So maintenance, building, operating, and also interconnecting was always an issue, because you always were talking with different standards, different specifications. So what we then decided, and it's 2-3 years old. I mean, what we did, we only announced it last year. We said we want a European workforce, European value chains, and Europe for our European future. And so what we said is, we sat together with our European partners and said, well, let's develop a standard, and we will make this standard available to society, so anyone can use that standard who wants the standard. We had a very specific definition of what that standard was. It was not functionality, because at the time we had no idea. You always learn and from where you come from. But at the time, it was the best thing to do to say, like, well, listen, this is the size. We want to double up the size, because at the end we have to sixfold the number of renewables that we have to connect by 2030. And so what we have now are really big, I would say, sockets where electricity from offshore wind farms can be connected. And they're roundabout, they could connect two very large, nuclear or coal power stations, but they now can connect the same amount or capacity of wind, offshore wind. What is the advantage? You need less systems, you need less resources, you need less, administration, less maintenance, and in the end you have learning curves for both. And I remember when we signed the big contract, we ordered 14 times 2 gigawatt, because TenneT Germany and TenneT Netherlands has to connect 40 gigawatt until 2030. This is huge. We're coming from 10 today. So we have to threefold our grid connection capacity and sixfold our the wind offshore capacity. So to do that, we decided that by 2031, we will be able to connect all those 40 gigawatts. And the beauty is, I would like to show it in a few slides, if that's possible.
The slides are coming.
What it really means, because in the end it is planning capability for platform producers, planning capability for our colleagues who are sitting here. And I remember a year ago when we were in Copenhagen at a very big trade fair, we said, well, operators, Ørsted and others, why don't you do the same for your own, for your wind farms? Go from a workshop, garage sort of facility into a serial. Okay, here we go. This is the 2 gigawatt as we see today. You see the big box on the left-hand side. This is where the connection of the wind farms come. We have a sea cable. It goes through the Wadden Sea, and then we have a very big converter station, and then a substation, and then it goes, at least in Germany, it goes into a very large north-south corridor of transport. Just to give you an example where we come from, we started, at 2 gigawatts. One box that you see in the North Sea when you go sailing is 5 times what we used to have when we started, or it's 3 times what is the current standard today, or it's 2 times what we have just connected. So I think it shows we need less steel, we need more power electronics, yes, we need less cables, and we can save the biodiversity in the sea basins. And the goal is basically to have a meshed offshore DC grid. Why? Because it is resilient. Second, because it is connecting. Third, because it can allow trade and physical wheeling of offshore electricity. And I think if we look at the North Sea and we look at all the renewable energies that we have in Europe and worldwide, and we want to triple our renewables, we know that we have to be competitive. And the North Sea today, in the last recent IRENA report, shows to be very competitive. So these are basically put together in one sentence. We have a 525 kV cabling system, not much bigger. It's this size roughly. So it's not so much bigger than what we used to do. It has a very big platform. As a standard, it has 66 kV direct link to the offshore wind parks, and then it is multi-terminal ready. So we can connect many countries, we can connect wind farms plus trade electricity. So I think that was something at the time that was, I'd say a new invention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to turn to the audience right now. Maybe you have some questions for our panelists. Maybe you would like to engage on anything that has been said so far. I don't see. We have a courageous person. Can you please introduce yourself?
Thank you. I'm Philip Jäger. I work for the Jacques Delors Center in Berlin on energy and climate policies. the panelists talked quite a bit about grids, and I was wondering whether at the informal ECOFIN and also in the other fora that you participate in, you've talked a little bit more about how to match the cost of grid building with the benefits of the grid. Because a lot of the big transmission lines that run, I don't know, from Spain to Germany, for instance, will have to be built by France or Spain, but will benefit industrial consumers in Germany. And so are there, what are your views or your hopes for how to finance those grids?
So thank you for your question. First of all, as I said, we need huge investment in grids, and that is normally private investment. But the case you're mentioning is an interconnector between, for example, Spain and France. In electricity, we already have since 10 years a fund connecting Europe facility, CEF, where we can co-finance these kind of huge projects. But it's really the top of the iceberg. And what is politically true as well, that sometimes that might benefit much more one country, one member state, and not the other. For example, in Europe, we have Spain and Portugal, which are very little interconnected with the rest of Europe. Germany is different, France is different, Slovenia is different, because they have a lot of neighboring countries where they're well connected. So we have a few, like the 3 Baltic states, Estonia, Lettonia and Lithuania, which are electricity-wise still connected to the Russian grid. We are now, since 10 years, working on desynchronization, and hopefully by next year, that is something that they are connected with the EU grid. But these are huge investments one member states cannot do alone. So we have money for that, connecting Europe facility, to facilitate these big projects. Coming back to Spain and France, with the Biscay Bay, that's an electricity connector. It's also a huge investment where we co-finance 50%, and we also are involved in talks at political level to make it happen. The next step here is, I think we need still a lot of electrification, and that's one of the future themes also for the next Commission. But we also speak more and more about hydrogen connection. And one next step is to get a hydrogen corridor from Spain, Portugal to Germany, because Germany needs more renewable hydrogen and cannot do it alone domestically. So the idea is to have a H2 Med corridor, which goes from Spain via France to Germany. And here again, no national member states can finance it alone, and the interest might be higher by Spain and Germany and less France, which is a transition country in that project. There are others. So what we are doing right now, it also got a status of project of common interest, so the CEF money. But these are really, as I said, the top of the iceberg, the big interconnection where EU money come in, because there's an EU added value, and we want to continue these possibilities. But I think the majority, what we need in the offshore wind, for example, and there is a very good cooperation in the North Energy Sea Corporation, you mentioned it already, where a number of EU member states get together with the offshore wind providers, with the network providers, network operators, and since 10 years. This network, North Sea Energy Corporation, and it's a political level, a ministerial level, a technical level, where we need to make progress. And there is a lot of question, for example, on the grid, if it's going from the offshore wind to one country, Belgium, but it can benefit the neighboring country. Who should pay for it? And where are the links? It's not only from one field to one country, but what we call meshed grids. So it covers different member states who can profit, and even not, I would even go further, it's not only Germany and Belgium who are, or Denmark on the coast, or UK, it goes further within the EU and the internal market. So, but that is another project where we are working together at a technical and a political level. And then there are multiple links which we need within a country, where we need to work on what we said to make it happen.
Thank you very much, Mechthild. Are there any other reactions to this question?
Maybe just to add to this, I think it's important that we focus not only on what technology we build today. So for example, if we look at the multi-terminal projects, you won't just have transition countries, yeah? If there's a benefit to have a station in France, you put a station in France. So that's the one thing. The other thing is, for example, especially with HVDC, we are more and more providing not only transfer of energy, which is what we know from the AC world, but we are providing ancillary grid services like grid forming, grid stabilization, etc. And these services will benefit all countries which are connected there. I mean, we built back-to-back solutions between France and Spain to basically help the Spanish grid to be stable in circumstances. Yeah? When we had the big outage in Norfolk in the UK, it was the HVDCs which provided a fast power transfer in order to stabilize the grid and avoid major outages in this area. So I think when we look at this from this perspective, what do we have already in our portfolio? Not what we connect right now today, what we planned like 10 years ago. There's a lot more of benefits which the grid brings to the table than just transferring energy. And hence it's not just a transition country, it's somebody who's participating in the network development measures and also benefiting from it.
Thank you. Vera, please.
Well, I think you addressed the right point. The system costs are going to be rising, and we're talking about competitiveness in Europe. So how can we solve that, that dilemma? Because in the end, if we don't have grids, we pay for redispatch and for the cost of non-grid. If we have the grids, we have to pay, for the depreciation. So right now, we see three different dilemmas. The redistribution effect, we already said it. There are winners and losers. So who's going to pay? And I think we have to find a solution, not wait until those who have vested interests come up with a solution. I think this needs to be solved differently. Second element that needs to be solved is that in the next 10 years, it is going to be the electricity customer paying for an infrastructure that is for the heating, for the transport, and for the industry customer. So how can we have, some sort of allocation of, or polluter pays principle, if we put it in a bad language. So there are ideas how to stretch, the payback period, for example. But I also think our third dilemma is what Ulrich said earlier. We have the demand risk that needs to be covered somehow. You cannot have an infrastructure. I think the infrastructure is a no regret because we will need it. And you cannot underdimension it because, adding later is more costly than doing it now immediately. But you must somehow lock in the customer's demand, because otherwise it is, you leave open the mid-chain element, which is, the developers of offshore wind farms. And that's what I think the next I think we already have enough offshore ideas on that, but leave it to Ulrich. For us, we can only say we need private money. We don't have enough liquid capital markets in Europe to pay at least what my company is investing for the next 10 years, which is 160 billion euros. It is very difficult to tap capital markets in Europe because we still have too much fragmentation. And the second thing is that we need to see how to distribute those costs and get it allocated where they really belong to.
Thank you. Ulrich, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a very, very good question since it created all these reactions. And only one thing for me to add is that on one hand, it does open up a lot of very, very complex potential interactions, sharing costs and revenues. And I guess we can build those systems in Europe. We are now trading along the same principles from the north of Finland to the south of Portugal. It has taken a few decades, but it's a really, really sophisticated machine of optimization. So we can do that. I must say, though, that at the same time, we have to keep in mind that we don't have 2 decades to develop a perfect system. We must keep in mind that you mentioned countries and thereby also transit countries, but I think the important thing here is citizens and businesses, and what level of socialization and what level of proper cost sharing. It's it's businesses along a line and it's citizens along a line, of course. And here I do think that at the end of the day, it will become immensely important how we can create an overlaying funding mechanism that can sufficiently socialize across all European citizens in always remembering, of course, that it's investments that we're talking about. It is infrastructure that will be used, it will be necessary, so it will make good business sense. But I think some kind of European level top-down funding machine will become very important for these very large projects. The money is simply too big. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have any other questions from the audience? If this is not the case, then I would like to thank our panelists wholeheartedly. Please give them a round of applause for a very interesting discussion on the future of the wind sector in Europe.